Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Plexus International's Improving Your AS9145 APQP for Aerospace. My name is Chris Peterson. I'll be moderator heading in the chat today if you do need support. And I'd like to introduce our speaker, Jeremy Hazel, master trainer, author, video producer extraordinaire. Jeremy has a broad range of topics and lots of other content available on our website. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out there are other resources available for 9145, AS9100, or others available on plexusintl.com. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand following our session today. If you do have any questions for Jeremy during or following up after the webinar, please do submit those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, if you need any support from me, please send it in via the chat. With that, Jeremy, hello, and let's get started.
All right, gang, and welcome. You guys are here for, as Chris said, the AS9145, how to improve it. Now, if you're looking for what AS9145 is, as part of improvement, you're going to get a little bit of awareness because maybe this is the first time you've heard of it. And the reason why we wanted to do this webinar is because AS9145 is how the industry is moving to get you to bring a product from concept into maturity in the aerospace arena. So some of you may never have heard of AS9145. Some of you may have AS9145 projects, but you're not sure kind of how to take them from so-so level up to something that is better than what you have today. So if you're brand new to the concept, we're going to cover a little bit of basics, but we're generally going to assume that you have a certain amount of awareness. And you'll notice the title of this webinar, the APQP of aerospace. APQP comes from the automotive world, and it's how they want you to bring an automotive product from concept into maturity. AS9145 shares very, very strong similarities with APQP. And if it helps you out, one thing you might think about AS9145 as is program management in the aerospace area. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a look kind of at what we're going to be doing today. The first thing we're going to take a look at is I'm going to talk about leveraging the quality tools in the aerospace area. Now, aerospace is an interesting area because some of the tools are not really universally applied. So you may have some primes, some customers that dictate one tool over another. So what I'm going to show you here is the general broad brush of, if you were brand new today, how some of these tools work together. Now, most of you on this webinar have some product that is currently being supplied to an aerospace customer. And you might notice that maybe your performance is lacking, maybe your on-time delivery is lacking, maybe your profitability is lacking. And when we, as consultants, go on to companies that are struggling with their AS9145 implementation, we follow this three-step process. So when you are struggling, be it PPM, be it the delivery schedule, or even in the deliverables for AS9145, most likely the first place you have to do and the first place you have to look, you have to restore the standard. Now, what does restore the standard mean? When you took on a job in the aerospace world, you went in and you committed to a certain quality level. You went in and you committed to a certain delivery level. And so you even internally to your management agreed to a certain profitability level. And so if you find your performance slipping, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to bring it back to the level that you originally agreed to. So step one is restore the standard. Whatever that standard is, get back to acceptable. And the tools you can use to do that, things like the control plan, or if it's applicable to your product, utilization of statistical process control. Unless you achieve the standard, the next step, achieving the theoretical, will never ever help you. Because if you have a wound and you're bleeding, if you don't stop the bleeding, then it doesn't matter. You'll never make it to care. So once you've done that and you've restored the standards, the second step is you then to try to achieve what we call the theoretical. Now, in the theoretical, the tool that we would like you to use, the tool that we use as consultants, is the failure modes and effects analysis, right? So the FMEA, in all its various forms, shares one very consistent trait. It is a theoretical, quantifiable estimate of the risk and performance for your product when it hits production. So if you've gone through and you've restored the standard back to the original agreement you made, the next step then is to use the FMEA to get back and match this theoretical baseline. This is also where performing supplier development makes a difference. Now, you notice that I put supplier development in achievement of the theoretical. Many companies prioritize supplier development, but that takes a lot of time. The only way to get to supplier development is to protect yourself first and probably look inside your own house first before going to somebody else's. And where we find AS9145, AS9145 is all the way up here for aspirational progression. So let's say that you've restored the standards, you're back to profitability, you've moved into the risk profile made present in your FMEA. The next step then is to use AS9145 to try and get ahead of it next time. Notice the term that we use here, in future jobs. AS9145 will not help you when the train is already on the track and headed toward the other train. At that point, it's too late. We call that triage, right? So if we follow this progression, what we're going to be talking with for the next hour here is really a new program. And AS9145 helps us drive that. So hopefully we don't end up over here trying to restore the standard post-launch. Now, the thing that I want to connect with before we leave this slide, the pain you experience over here begins over here. So all of the issues that you are experiencing currently in the product you produce for your aerospace clients is 100% initiated during the AS9145 activity. Now, that makes AS9145 a huge strategic multiplier. Why? Because there is leverage. So let's talk about if AS9145 applies leverage because it's earlier in the process, why are aerospace customers beginning to require it? First of all, AS9145 allows you to have a very high level view and a very good view of the direct resources you're going to need in order to pull off the activities that you're expected to perform. The second one, and this should come as no surprise to anybody that's in manufacturing, early identification of required changes. I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. The earlier you can identify a change, the easier it's going to be, and probably the less money it's going to cost. You identify changes to the design prior to cutting tooling, your costs are going to be fractional as opposed to cutting that tool and then having to modify the tool post. If we utilize AS9145, we stand a better chance of avoiding late changes. And lastly, the goal of AS9145 is to get the quality product that you agreed to produce on time at the lowest cost, both from the customer, but also from your organization. because your organization has to be profitable as well. Unless you're a not-for-profit, turns out the bottom line matters. So this is what customers are trying to do with this AS9145 standard. And so when we look at how this works, and this is largely for my people that don't know about AS9145, this graphic we have right here is the general flow. So we're going to take a look at this here real fast before we get into our 6 rules. And we're going to start moving through, and notice that there are 5 phases. There's planning, then there's product design and development, and there's process design and development. Now notice there's an important thing here. Notice right here that what we have is a simultaneous development. Product and process initiate at the same time, but process starts maturing its way in with this little ramp here. So notice that this all occurs when you get to the planning phase, because when you engage in planning, guess what? Product and process, you're beginning to make decisions. Now, between kickoff, your end of concept, and your eventual design release, this is where the design kicks off, and now it's full on process. And you'll notice that there's a little angle right here. This area right here says there's a lot of activity at this point, and it tapers off at the same time we begin to validate. And eventually you get product approval. And during this validation, the ongoing production and post-delivery service ramps up. This is literally production launch. Notice they have some events, PPAP approval. So when we look at AS9145, the big idea is the product that you end up with in the mass production phase is the result of your AS9145 activity. The way I've summed it up here, it is the result of the quality of event leading to launch. So if you need to restore the standards post-launch over here, guess what? It's because you messed up in the decisions all the way through here. So this is a big deal when we talk about, there's a very specific word here. It's called quality of event, right? Is it possible for you to do AS9145 and hit all of the activities, hit all of the deliverables? Absolutely. And can you still have a poor AS9145 deployment? 100%. Why? Because if you're using it as a check the box activity, it will never yield the quality of event that allows you to do anything actionable. So what I'd like to do here, we've been going for a little bit here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to administer our first of 2 polls. Now, the polls serve a purpose. When I'm talking to you about AS9145, I don't know everything about who's out there in webinar land. So this gives me a chance to say, how many people might I have that have problems with control plans? How many people might I have that problems with FMEAs? It allows me to tailor the rest of the presentation to get to know a little bit about you. And secondly, it makes sure that you're paying attention and not out there asleep at the wheel. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to launch this, and we've got 3 questions in this first poll. Let's go ahead and launch this one. All right, the first poll. What component of AS9145, where is your organization's blind spot? And notice I've got process design, product design, MSA, FAI, PPAP, or other. The next one, if you work in the supplier field, where are your suppliers weak? And the third one, what is most challenging about AS9145? I have a rule. We stop the fun when we get to 70%. So right now we're sitting at about a little over 10%. We're going to keep that climbing. All right, we're starting to get in here. And this allows me, for the 6 rules that we're about to talk about, what we're talking about here in terms of how we improve it, I'm going to be able to tailor the message to the people that I have in the room. Right, we are sitting over 35% here. We are at the halfway point, folks. Keep on moving. All right. And we're almost there. We're going to creep over that bar. Again, this is very much program management. I have no delusion we will ever get to 100%. I'll take 70% any day. Plus, by the time you have 70% of the data, it's harder to change the averages. All right, let's go ahead and end poll. And we're going to go ahead and share out the results. And the reason why I share this with you folks, sometimes in manufacturing, aerospace manufacturing, it seems like you're out there on an island. This shows you that you're unique, but maybe no different than the person next to you. So collectively in this poll, most people have issues with the FMEA. That is overwhelmingly, if we combine those, the majority. The second question, when it comes to suppliers, getting a quality PFMEA from your suppliers, that's always a little bit of a challenge. Good news is you're not unique. And the third one here, when it comes to AS9145, it's really an even split here in terms of the realistic planning, the discipline to do the things we know we should be doing, and collaborations with your internal teams. So I'm going to put that down, collaboration with the internal, and we'll talk about that with the 6 rules. We're going to talk about discipline, and we're going to talk about planning. Okay, that gives me what I need there. I'm going to stop sharing, and let's go ahead and dig into the large amount of the content here. Now, what we decided to do in terms of how we help, we went through and we wanted to kind of talk about how the customer supplier relationship looks. This is something that is not often included in these types of seminars because nobody likes to talk about the fact that customer and supplier really see things differently. But because we wanted to add value, I think it's worth it whether you're on the customer side or the supplier side to understand the view from both sides of the fence. When it comes to the customer wants to define all the requirements and they want you to understand all the expectations. Then you select the disciplines, individuals, and suppliers that have to be added to the team. They want you to assess the feasibility of the proposed design, the performance requirements, and the process. They expect identification of cost, timing, constraints. And then they want to know what you need from them. And then they want to know how you're going to bring their product into maturity. Now, on the other side, this right here, this is a line, folks, right here. And on the other side of this line is the supply base. The supplier says, we've been making a similar product for many years. So let's say that you are looking at a new hydraulic system and you source a seal supplier. That seal supplier has been making the same seal for many, many years, and probably even for you as a customer for several projects. What they're doing is they have similar characteristics from seal to seal to seal. So while you might think I want you to evaluate this as its own special thing, they're saying we have a common seal with general characteristics that we've sold to you 100 times before. They also have built their systems largely based on their own families. So this is a big thing. A lot of customers will want a custom FMEA based on their unique product started from scratch. Whereas your supply base is going to say, we've got a family style in which we look at how this works, and we're going to give you the family with modifications. And so what you'll largely get from the supplier is, we've already done a PPAP on this for another supplier or another customer, so you're going to get it with the new customer data. Now notice each side of this equation isn't wrong. It's just a different view. And the reason why I wanted to start with this, if you are working with suppliers, coordinating your AS9145 activity, we've developed 6 rules that have been battle tested by us over 20 years in different methods of program management, knowing that this is the dichotomy that you face. So let's go ahead and take a look first and foremost at rule 1. Now, rule number 1 when it comes to AS9145, the multidisciplinary team that you choose must be competent and effective. Now, these are 2 very distinct words right here. Competent and effective. Competent means able to achieve results. So competence is different than training. Let me ask you this. When you have a design engineer who is engaged in a new multidisciplinary team, how do you know they are competent? A degree does not make them competent. They could have been designing Ziploc bags yesterday, and now you have them designing braking systems. Training does not equal competence. You could be completely trained and absolutely incompetent. And I'm sure we all have experience from people that we've worked with in the past. And over here, the team has to be effective. So if you are launching an AS9145 project, the 3 major objectives of any program management system are on time, on spec, on budget. So if you choose a multidisciplinary team that has a history of not launching on time, you have already lost the battle. So when you think about it, selection of who you choose to be on that team needs to be carefully considered. We mistake multidisciplinary team with just choosing whoever might happen to be in the hallway. So when we do that, we have to take into account our organizational landscape. What is the availability of the resources that we have? If we do not have the right resources, we need to raise our hand and we may have to contract, or we have to manage our expectations to underpromise so that we can overdeliver. Secondly, we should choose based on a familiarity with the technologies needed. And one of my best tips, that 3rd bullet, familiarity with the customer organization and expectations. AS9145 and PPAP submission is about knowing that next customer and being able to navigate their system. And that won't happen in the first job. You're going to have to do a couple jobs with them in order to understand their system, their culture, and those implied expectations. Okay, hear me very carefully on that. There are expressed expectations. Those are given into the requirements. But there is always, always, always an implied requirement. And unless you've worked with them before, you may not know all of those implied rules. Plus, when it comes to product awareness, this is a big one for the people who are the customer on this side. It is your job 100% to tell that supplier what is the product's intended functionality, where the product is intended to be used, the expected performance, suggest changes where appropriate. You need to be able to tell them how you as the customer plan on assembling the product. All right, notice these are all customer provided. And whomever is your lead on that project needs to be the single most knowledgeable source on your customer specific requirements. Okay, hear me very clearly on that. We see this all the time in organizations where they may have a brand new SQE going to a supplier, and that supplier is actually educating them on what their requirements are. That only ends one way. That is going to end in a flaming ball. So rule number 1, put some strategy into the multidisciplinary team. Focus on competence and effectiveness. Be realistic with your organizational landscape. And as the customer, it is your job to provide an insane level of product awareness to help the supplier do theirs. One of my favorite tips for this, because I want to give you a tip for this rule. My boss, when I was coming up in industry, he always had the top three. So what happened was you had three priorities on your whiteboard. There was a long-term one, maybe a job you were working on, just like an AS9145 job. There was something intermediate, and there was something that you could knock off within the week. It was a short-term thing. And you were only allowed to work on the top three. And if anybody challenged you on the top three and tried to add, they had to go to your supervisor, and that supervisor had to remove one from those three. What this started was the conversation. And for those of you out there that are saying the resource allocation problem is an issue, this alleviates a lot of that issue, because most of the resource allocation issues I see are not due to actual resource allocation, they're due to visibility. So make the bottleneck visible. All right, let's take a look at rule 2. So if you're looking at AS9145, rule 2 is establish multi-directional and robust information channels. Now, believe it or not, these are different. You can have a multi-directional channel that is not robust, or you can have a robust communication channel, but it is unidirectional. The communication flow, right? The channel of communication has to be timely. So if you've just finished your design review and you need to pass that over to the customer, how does it get done in a timely manner? Not wait for the next month and a half summit. This communication flow, you have to allow for feedback loops. This is that bi-directional, right? And this one is big if you're on the customer side. Folks, we have to have a way to communicate where the supplier is able to initiate that communication. By design, so many of the communication channels that we see in industry are unidirectional, customer to supplier, customer to supplier. The supplier has to be able to initiate, and from the customer side, you ask, how does this happen? Now, the robustness of the communication must be based on an appropriate level of risk. So let's say you finish that design review that we just talked about. You see a very real issue in the interface with that customer part. It is not enough to put it into the portal, send it on its way, and then check back in 6 weeks to determine if they got it. That's not a robust communication channel, because if it gets overlooked, you will cut tooling, you will release prints that will not interface. The second bullet, one of the best things you can do, you've heard of lagging and leading indicators, embed it in a process so that that process cannot skip to the next step without the required communication. Your process approach will be key in building these. One of the things we have here along this right-hand side for you is we have some very common things that you would communicate as part of AS9145 and how these communications happen historically. So as an example, characteristics, tolerances, and specs are seen in engineering drawings. Sequences of processes are translated into process flowcharts. Possible risks are communicated through the process FMEA. Controls to ensure production are shown in the control plan, and the clear instructions for operators are in the work instructions. Now, this is one of these things that I figure I'll bring it up in rule 2. This is the big one if you are on the customer side, for those of you that deal with your suppliers. And if you are the supplier, this also applies to you. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. When you get any sort of communication in the FMEA, think of it like risk. So if I am the customer and the supplier gives me a severity of 8, an occurrence of 6, and a detection of 5, the way that you should read it from here on out, this is an admission of risk that my supplier is going to introduce into my process. Now, what do I do with this risk? I have to fortify my own process, because what the supplier has just told me, if they mess up, I am going to be negatively impacted. There's a very real chance on a scale of 1 to 10 that they will mess up. And if they mess up, there is a better than average chance it's coming out the door. So I can either be surprised when they send it to me, shut my line down, or put the bad part into my part, or I can understand this risk and I can then design my process to mitigate it, knowing that I really have no real control over my supplier. So folks, PFMEA is an admission of risk. And if you are submitting a PFMEA to a customer, know that this is your risk profile that you pose to their part, and communicate it up and down these robust and multi-directional information channels. I see far too many SQEs that just approve FMEAs, just looking for high action items or RPNs or some imaginary number. Now, rule 3, engage and integrate your lower tier suppliers early. Now, this is not always possible and perfect, okay? I'm not even going to pretend that it is. But the thing that I want to show you here, when you are dealing with a prime, when you are dealing with a high level type OEM, they know a certain amount of years early when they build the plane. When you are the tier 1, you get kicked off around here. When you become the tier 2, you get kicked off later. And by the time you're down at like tier 10, you really have very little time. So the guidance here, engage your lower tier suppliers as early as possible, because the lower you are down the supply chain, the shorter time you have. Okay. This is a big deal. And it also works the same way with resources. Typically, your top tiers have more people, and the further you go down the tier chain, the less people they have. So if you're going to task a lower tier down here, you want to give them every chance to get their people moving and organized as early as possible. In order to do this, it's essential they understand the intent of their product, their role in early involvement. Maybe it's so early they can't even give a firm commitment, but at the same time, maybe they have input into how you might design that component if they're just build to print. And then the third one, I'll tell you, a lot of customers do a poor job at defining the deliverables for these lower tiers. Most of the friction that we see in these relationships is caused by not understanding the deliverables, and then new things are added time and time and time again. So this is a big one over here on the side here. I really like this one. Remember the supplier and the customer view from the early part? The supplier either has to meet your AS9145 expectations, or you must agree to their level of activity. So it is a contractual negotiation, and engaging and integrating lower tiers early allows you to have that to minimize the friction. What you really want is the least amount of friction in the relationship between you and the supply base. Now, communication. Rule 4, we talked about rule 2, communication channels being multi-directional and also robust. This comes into the communicate often and communicate early. Now, most of us, and I'll say I did this early on, I'm with you, we'll take a look at the AS9145 and we'll put in certain milestones, let's say, right? And right here, the milestones of AS9145 provide chances to check progress, but are not adequate to do the work that leads to the progress. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say that you're in the planning phase and you've got some feasibility to do. You're going through here and you find a feasibility issue here. You don't wait until you're into concept to communicate it. Most people only put in their communication when they report out on it. But here's the piece they miss. They don't put the communication channel in with enough time to do the work. Okay. So there should be time to do the work and there should be time for resolution. If you are only looking at communication channels that detect the issue, you have already lost. So when it comes to rule 4, if the communication channels are multi-directional, they're robust. Now we apply those communication channels into intervals, which allows your supplier-customer relationship to not only identify the issue, but gives it time to work itself out and reach resolution. The do the work and the resolution piece is the piece that most organizations inherently struggle with. Now, an example of this, one tool that has worked well for us, when we sit down to do a job, we put down as an example, we use the FMEA here. You could use anything. And we get very clear rules of engagement, what the issue is, when we tell, and who we tell. One thing that I'm going to tell you in the early phases of program development, poor contracts lead to conflict. So if you do not identify a communication plan early in the AS9145 development, you will inevitably experience the friction that I'm describing. All right. Perfect. All right. We had 2 polls here. We're going to go ahead and we're going to launch the second poll. I still have 2 rules to go, folks. 2 rules still remaining. Let's go ahead and launch the second poll. All right. Now, this next poll requires me to kind of know a little bit about which risk methodology you're going to use, because whether or not you're aware, aerospace AS9145 says you'll use a risk-based methodology, and there are a variety of them to choose from. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to launch this poll here. First question, what is your organization using for risk mitigation? And what is your preferred method for learning? All right, we'll give you 1 second here. All right, for some reason, this one did not launch.
There we go, Jeremy.
There we go. Perfect. All right. Thank you, Chris, for the air support. All right. Yep. Famika. All right. Got a little bit of 4th edition going on. All right. We got some SAE. That's a popular one. And the reason why I need this information, it is going to help me frame out the last 2 rules. All right, and we hit that 70%. All right, sharing results. So an overwhelming majority of you are actually using another form of FMEA that isn't listed. So this is a big deal in the AS9145 area. There is no standardization or universal requirement on how you address risk. Now, the other thing that this does for you, and the reason that I share this with you, if you are new to AS9145, here are some of the very common ways that people do this. The SAE J1739 is one method of risk FMEA. We could look at the FMECA, the failure mode effect and criticality analysis. The AIAG FMEA 4th edition is a popular one. And the new kid on the block is the AIAG VDA FMEA. So that's a little bit on here. Let's go ahead and stop sharing and let's take on the last 2 here. All right, when it comes to understanding all requirements, okay, this is an interesting rule. It's not necessarily new. I'm sure everybody understands you're striving to understand all the requirements, But when we talk about FMEA, the reason why I needed that information before, when we look at this, most companies are requirements focused, but I need you to understand that when it comes to risk analysis, requirements are the measurable manifestations of function. Okay. Functional analysis is the key to proper requirements analysis. Now, an example of this, let's do an example. We can look at the idea of delivery, right? Delivery is a function. It could have 3 requirements: correct day, correct time, correct quantity. So there can be a one-to-many relationship between one function and multiple requirements. So one of the things we talk about here is, in understanding all requirements, you should be able to map them into functionality. And functionality will be far more beneficial to your DFMEA than requirements analysis. An example for stop the plane means right distance within the right air conditions, or I should say the right weather conditions and the right pressures. When you're looking at this Rule 5, we are pretty good in the aerospace world at making sure we hit the regulatory and safety, but you want that to come from the customer. Okay. Now, as the commodity expert, you may know in braking systems what your regulatory requirements are from your commodity, but you may not know what's on the other side from the customer. And what you're trying to get at, you're trying to understand what they consider important. You then augment them with your own known requirements. And every requirement should have a source. And coming back now to Rule 1, we're coming back full circle. Once you have these functions and these requirements, you're going to want to compare them back against the competency of that multidisciplinary team. If your multidisciplinary team is jacked up, you're going to have a very hard time meeting them. And folks, as I mentioned before, there are explicit and there are implicit, implied requirements. You're going to want somebody that understands both, and that only comes from working with the customer on more than one project. And the last big rule here, once you learn the lesson in AS9145, you're going to want to adopt what you learned and augment into your organization's knowledge management. Okay. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that change won't occur. Between the time you get the job and the time you start work, change will occur. So when we do this in AS9145, we make sure that the changes are evaluated both in terms of their function and their finance. Okay. Never forget that you have a need as well. Your customer has a need for the part that you are making. Your organization has a need to do what is financially into the organization's best interest. Any changes that occur, capture it in the PPAP as a contractual record. Folks, in aerospace, the same as automotive, the PPAP is the legally binding document of what you are providing. So if change occurs, make sure that PPAP represents the part as you are currently providing it. Now, when we talk organizational knowledge structures, everybody has their own way of doing this. If you have lessons learned, great. If you have lessons learned database, great. If you're using foundation and families FMEAs, great. Somehow though, the changes that apply to future developments somehow need to be canonized into these organizational structures. Okay. This is a part that a lot of people don't learn, and they end up making the same mistake over and over and over. And the reason why, these organizational knowledge structures pass the changes to the intellectual property of the facility. Folks, we are in a situation in which the average millennial will stay with a company only 3 years. So it is entirely possible that The person who begins the program will not even be there for the launch and mass production of the program, let alone the next program. So organizational knowledge is a big, big deal. So coming back here and getting clear on the 6 rules. First rule, your multidisciplinary team is everything. You might have seen in my bio that I specialize in small team development. If your team is malfunctioning, if your team is not competent and effective, no system you put in front of them will matter. Second rule, I need the multi-directional and the robust information channels. Third rule, I need to apply those channels, engage and integrate with my lower tier suppliers at the earliest possible moment. From there, I set the communication intervals to often and early, with enough time to do the work and enough time to reach resolution. The 5th rule, once I have those in place, I go through and I make sure I understand everything, both implicit and explicit, that they're asking me to do. And lastly, as I learn from one project to the next, I would rather get up every day and make a new mistake, not make the same mistake that I made yesterday. Same thing with the program. So folks, these are the 6 rules that we have found here at Plexus in order to improve APQP. And when we coach, this is the kind of stuff that keeps you, honestly, from coming back here and having to call somebody to restore the standard because you didn't get it right over here. All right, Chris, are you with us?
Yes. Hi, Jeremy. Great
All
job.
right.
And I love this slide. A lot of information.
All right. Chris, do we have any questions today, my friend?
Yeah. And before we get to those, I just want to remind folks to visit plexusintl.com for more information on 9145, to find videos or other resources, training workshops, e-learnings, and more. The first question we have, and just a reminder, folks, do submit anything you have down in the Q&A. First question we have, how do I convince management to restore the standards? And where do I take this information from here?
Easy. Restoring the standards, that's the simple part. There is a magic method out there, and I say magic method, it's been around for 40 years. We just haven't gotten the message in 40 years. It's called cost to quality. Cost to quality defines anything that doesn't go right up into either external, internal, appraisal, or prevention. So when we look at that, and here's the easiest way to restore the standards. You take your PFMEA, you go out to the line and you look at the scrap bins. You look at the Pareto for scrap, you count up the number of scrap, you multiply by the cost of the part, and then that becomes your barometer to improve your PFMEA, because every piece of scrap in that bin is there to failure to fulfill a requirement. So let's say you took the job on at 1.5% scrap. You're currently sitting at 4%. The delta between 1.5 and 4 is 2.5%. If you take 2.5% over your volume multiplied by your piece price, you can easily find $200,000 to $300,000. So here's the way you pitch it to management. You speak the language of management, time and money. They don't understand RPN. They don't understand FMEA. They don't speak our language. They speak time and money. So cost to quality would be your primary barometer. Yep.
Great information. Thanks. Next question. Incoming materials, those must have an effect on 9145?
Now, this is an interesting one. You remember when I said that sub-tier supplier? Yeah. Here's the dichotomy, and this is the great lie that we all tell ourselves, is that we use the term supplier control. We don't control our suppliers. Our suppliers control us. And if you're ever in doubt of that, just have them shut off the supply of supplied parts. I guarantee you flinch before they do. So when we look at those incoming products, just like you mentioned, they do have an effect. And this is why the early engagement with the supply base and effectively reading their FMEA will tell you, when you do your process design, where to fortify. Folks, if you read your supplier PFMEA correctly, they're giving you the keys to their risk. you can take that risk analysis and say, wow, there's a really good chance that we're going to get a part that's out of profile here. You know what? We should probably protect our own neck when we do the hard tooling for our process. That's the only way out. So yes, incoming products have a very real impact in 9145. They are one of the primary drivers of not on time, not on spec, and not on budget. So that's why early and often. Yep.
Thank you. Here's one from, how can I assure APQP milestones are fully integrated into the industrialization plan so I can have the right leverage to assure my programs are performing well?
Okay. So this is a question of responsibility and authority. You know, from the AS9145 side, what you have to do, right? There's certain activities which create the deliverables. And so you're going to have to learn to lead from the side, which is if that deliverable is part of that industrialization, how do you get to the process owner for that industrialization process? And then how do you create a very simple PDCA feedback loop? Because in AS9145, you plan it. Hopefully they do it, but here's what you're asking. You're missing the check part of the loop. And it varies from company to company. So one of the programs, or I should say one of the books that I really like on organizational change, it's called The Solution Focus. Think about an area in your organization where that feedback loop goes well, and then figure out what made it go right. And then replicate the success factors into the other deliverable areas. That's the trick. Too many people think about what goes wrong. They analyze to death what goes wrong. Pick where it went right, and then figure out what those are that you have to move into that check loop. But that's exactly how you do it. And folks, this is universal. We always think we need a new tool. Most human beings have not mastered plan, do, check, act. Pretty good at planning, really good at doing, not so great at the checking part. Now, that's the great hiccup right there. All right.
Here's a related question: that any suggestions from an internal audit perspective on how to best incorporate these requirements into an audit plan?
Absolutely. This is where we talk about the safety, the regulatory, the implicit, and the expressed, right? So if you're looking at the internal audit plan, figure out what is the customer specific requirements. Let's say the big deals, usually they're the safety ones, the regulatory. You're not going to have time in an internal audit to check all. You're going to have to triage and Pareto. And when I do that, I think as an auditor, what keeps my customer up at night? If I can think of what keeps my customer up at night, I know where to target. And I'll give you an example. Let's say we're using the same seal that we've used in the last 5 programs, but this new seal has a subtle change in the diameter. I'm going to be very interested from an internal standpoint on the deltas regarding that diameter change, what its impact is on my manufacturing organization, how we're controlling change. What I'm not going to be worried about is the rubber that we've used on the same similar pressures for the last 30 years. That is not the thing that I'm so worried about. Yep.
Great. And I just want to remind everyone this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you following this live event. We'll send an email to your registered email address for that. Any tips for managing APQP when the supplier has no authority over their design? Example, printed circuit board manufacturer who may have a capability but does not design the product.
Correct. So you're dealing with specifically build to print. When you are managing that and they have no authority over their design, that's actually very simple because then they're just a processor. So it really is just manage them through from APQP. And if you're buying an off-the-shelf program, say that you buy an off-the-shelf PCB board, awesome. So other than that, your supplier management. That's it. All that is that's just a build to print organization for the PCB boards. That's it.
All right, and here's the last one we'll take. Can the earliest sub-tier engagement be performed only after the make or buy decision of my tier 1 supplier?
Absolutely not. I would definitely go through and I would engage my sub tier as a potential make buy. Because let's think of it this way. If you go out to somebody and you want them to produce something for you, and you engage them early and they ask really good questions in a needs analysis, that shows that they have an interest, they have expertise, and this will greatly influence my make buy decision. Because can I make it? Sure. But they were so interested in me that might I buy it from them? Absolutely. And I'll say it's the same thing as a training provider, right? With what we do. If you go to the training provider and they just try to say, here's an off the shelf product, probably not right. If they do an in depth needs analysis, can you make in house training? Absolutely. But if they're doing a needs analysis, they get to know you. It will help determine what the depth might be, and then it will influence your decision. So I always go out to see what's available anyway, even if I might do it in house, because you only know what you know. They'll help you identify what you don't know.
Great, great advice. Well, thanks a lot, Jeremy. We'll, like I said, we'll put this recording on our website, email it out to folks. If you're looking for more information on 9145, please do visit our website at plexusintl.com. We have some great downloads, other related videos on this, or on our YouTube page. Check us out on LinkedIn, connect with us online, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks a lot.